Okay, so we're gearing up for Rosh Hashanah, of course. And today what we're going to do is we're going to look at the message or the idea of the shofar on 3 levels. And the way we've identified them here is, as you can see in the title over here, the mitzvah. Then there is the symbolism. There's symbolism of the shofar, as you can see here. And then there's the essence of the shofar. And what's going to be beautiful is that once we reveal the essence of the shofar, we're going to re-examine the symbolism in the mitzvah, and it takes it on to a whole new level. So when I say the word mitzvah, I mean here just simply in like the halachic sense, in the like Jewish legal sense. What's the definition of the mitzvah? What makes it a mitzvah, where it comes from, just on, it's like almost like a legal halachic basis, not technical. I'm not going to get into like the technical laws of how the shofar is blown, just to kind of give the crux of where it comes from and the way it's defined in Jewish legal code. And then the symbolism will be, of course, some of the messaging that the shofar is supposed to elicit from the listener, from the one who's hearing the sound of the shofar. And then the essence, as we'll see, is the Hasidic Kabbalistic interpretation of what is accomplished, spiritually speaking, by the shofar. So let's begin then with the legal halachic definition of the shofar. So where does it come from? So the word shofar does not appear in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, that is, with respect to Rosh Hashanah. What the verse reads is as follows, as you can see right here in the Hebrew. Daber al bnei Yisrael, speak to the Jewish people. Lemor, saying, God tells Moshe, please relay the following message to the Jews. B'chodesh hashvi'i, on the 7th month, be'echad l'chodesh, on the 1st day of the month. So the 7th month is the month of Tishrei. Now, even though you might be wondering, isn't Tishrei, Rosh Hashanah, the new year? So wouldn't that be the 1st month? Good question. But the essence of it is that the calendar is really divided into 2, months and year. Months and year are really unrelated. The months follow the pattern of the moon. The moon and the Earth's orbit is such that they meet each other at every 29.5 days. So that's the month. The month is determined by that cycle. And then there is the cycle of the sun and the earth. And that is 365.25 days, I think, somewhere around there. And that's what determines the year, when the sun and the earth come back to the same point. Whereas the months is when the moon and the earth come back to the same point. So they're really unrelated. So the beginning of the year is, technically speaking, the beginning of the year, as in the solar year, is technically speaking the month of Nisan, the month when the Jewish people come out of Egypt, the month of Pesach. The beginning of the 12 months cycle begins at Rosh Hashanah, at the new year, at Tishrei. So we really have 2 beginnings to the Jewish calendar. The beginning of the months, that is in Tishrei, and the beginning of the year, the solar year, which is in Nisan. For all intents and purposes, we just focus on one of them, which is the month of Tishrei, because our calendar follows by the months. You know, which day of the month are you going to meet me? So we just kind of go with the new year for the months to be the new year period. But in biblical terms, the 7th month is the month of Tishrei, because it's 7th month from Nisan, from the month that we come out of Egypt, from the month of Pesach. So on the 1st day of the 7th month, the 1st day of Tishrei, Yiyeh lachem, it shall be for you, Shabbaton, a day of rest. So it's a holiday, a day when no work is allowed. Zichron Tua, a remembrance for blasts of a horn of some sort. Mikra Kodesh, it should be called holy unto you. So that is the entirety of the biblical reference to shofar. All it says is, on the 1st day of the 7th month, that is the 1st day of Tishrei, you shall celebrate it as Shabbaton, as a day of rest, as a holy, sanctified day of rest when no work is allowed. And on that day, there should be a remembrance of blasting, without defining what this blast is, what to use. So it's quite ambiguous It just says, remember it through blasts, through teruah. But we have a pasuk in Tehillim, a verse in Psalms. You can see here the number, it's 81:14, where there it says, Tiku b'chodesh shofar, blast on the month with a shofar. So now the verse refers to some month in which a shofar is blasted. So now we get some more details. And when is that? Bekesa l'yom chagenu. On the day of your celebration, that's the second words here, l'yom chagenu, here. But bakesa, on a day of concealment. So what the verse is saying is, there's a holiday in which the moon is concealed, which is unique, because most holidays, Sukkot, Pesach, Shavuos, not Shavuos, but Sukkot and Pesach, those holidays are in the middle of the month, on the 15th. And the 15th of the month, the moon is at its fullest. But there is one holiday in which the moon is concealed, because it's the beginning of the month. That would be the month, the holiday of Rosh Hashanah. It's the only holiday that exists on the beginning of the month. Now we know that there is a holiday at the beginning of the month because the verse had already told us, on the 7th month, on the first day. So we know that there is a holiday on the first day of the month. And therefore, when the verse in Tehillim says, blast the shofar on a holiday in which the moon is concealed, we know it's referring to Rosh Hashanah, because that is the one and only holiday in which the moon is concealed on that holiday, because it's the first day of the month. So now the verse in Tehillim gives us more detail. Whereas the verse in scripture, the verse in Chumash, in the 5 books of Moses, just says blast, remembering of blasts, without telling us what to use to make those blasts. The verse in Tehillim says, shofar, blast your shofar on that holiday in which the moon is concealed. Blast your shofar on the holiday that's on the first day of the month. That is the first day of the month of Tishrei, Rosh Hashanah. Okay, it's a little bit long-winded, but I hope we got that clear. If it's not, please interrupt me. So here the Gemara, this is the Talmud, Tractate Rosh Hashanah 9a, tells us the following. You can follow along in the English. I'll read it in the Hebrew, but you can follow in the English there. And he essentially lays out what I just told you. Rabbi Yitzchak says, Lama taikim Rosh Hashanah. Why do we blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah? So the Gemara asks, Lama taikin, you're asking us why we blow the shofar? Rachmana amar tiku. The verse says in Psalms, tiku, blast the shofar. So says the Gemara, no. Ela lama marin, we're asking, why is there a teruah? A teruah versus a tekiah, as we know, tekiah is a long blast. It's uninterrupted, whereas a teruah is an interrupted blast. We have 2 versions of teruah. One referred to as shivarim, the 3 medium-sized blasts, and another one that we refer to colloquially as teruah, which is those 9 tiny little ones. But those are both referred to biblically as teruah, essentially a blast that is broken up. So the verse in Tehillim says, tiku, blast the shofar, using that word tekiah, which means a long interrupted blast. And the Gemara therefore asks, elalama marian, why do we do the teruah, which is the blast that's broken up? Says the Gemara, Marian Rachmana Amar Zikra Teruah. The reason why we do the teruah, which is the broken up blast, because the verse refers to Rosh Hashanah as Zichron Teruah, the day to remember in these teruah, in these broken up sounds of the shofar. And this is a reference to the 2 verses we quoted earlier up here. Okay. A little bit more from the Talmud. And this, we're taking a little bit of a journey here through the Talmud, through a discussion in the Talmud to get to a main statement that comes at the end of this discussion. So if you don't follow what we're about to read, you can interrupt me to ask for clarification, but not to worry, we're going to get to the main point at the end. Okay. So I hope everything I said till now is clear. If it's not, please again interrupt me. So the Mishnah taught that in the temple, they didn't just blow the shofar, they would also have 2 trumpets that would accompany the shofar. That's what the Mishnah says. So here in the synagogue, we only use a shofar, but in the temple, they actually would have 2 trumpets that would accompany whoever it was that was sounding the shofar. So the Gemara asks, "V'trei koli mim nishtame," is it possible for someone to discern between 2 sounds at once? How is that possible? And here we're being told that you got to hear the shofar because that's the mitzvah. And yet in the temple, there was shofar along with these trumpets. How could one discern between the two sounds? How could one fulfill the obligation to hear the shofar if it's being overshadowed or being accompanied with this other sound from trumpets? And the Gemara solidifies, the Talmud solidifies this question of how is it possible for someone to hear two sounds by telling us the following teaching. V'atanya, we have been taught in a Mishnaic age text, which reads, Zachar v'shamar b'dibur echad, nemru. The word zachar, which means remember, and the word shamar, which means to guard or to keep, were said simultaneously in one utterance, in a single utterance, as the translator puts it here. What he's referring to is, we know, of course, that the Ten Commandments is repeated twice in the Torah. Once when God gives the Torah in the Parsha of Yisro, and then once, again later, when Moshe Rabbeinu repeats the entire Torah, he repeats as well the Ten Commandments in Va'etchanan. Now, there are some discrepancies, some change in language between the first time the Ten Commandments are stated and the second time. Specifically here, we're referring to the way in which Torah tells us to keep Shabbos. It's one of the Ten Commandments. So the way in which Torah tells us to keep Shabbos on the first set of the Ten Commandments is Zachar es Yom HaShabbos, remember the day of Shabbos. The second time Torah tells us to keep Shabbos, it says Shomar es Yom HaShabbos, keep or guard Shabbos. So explain our sages, Zachar v'Shomar b'dibur echad. We say this at Lechadodi, right? On Lechadodi on Friday night, we say Zachar v'Shomar b'dibur echad. This is what we're referring to. When God said the word remember Shabbos and guard Shabbos, those two words, remember and guard, Zachar and Shomar, were said simultaneously by God. And the Mishnah continues and comments, Masha'ein hapeh yochel l'daber. This is something that a human mouth cannot do. A human mouth cannot utter two sounds at once. And additionally, ve'ein ha'oizen yochel l'shmoya. The ear cannot hear. The ear cannot hear two sounds at once, either one or the other. Now, this is being cited here as proof that seemingly we could not hear the shofar in the temple if there are also trumpets being blasted. In the same way, the Mishnah declares that it's impossible for a human being to hear two words at once, Zachar and Shamar, remember and guard. And it was this supernatural, miraculous experience that at the Ten Commandments, we were told two words at once, but ordinarily, human being cannot comprehend two words at once. So if that's the case, when we hear in the temple, the shofar and the trumpet simultaneously, seemingly, we should not be able to discern the two sounds, thus making the entire sound of the shofar null and void. So says the Gemara, Lakach, for this reason, Marich b'shofar. In the temple, the shofar and the trumpets were sounded simultaneously, but at one point the trumpet stopped and the shofar would keep on going. And this way, you can hear the shofar after the trumpets have finished. And this is the Gemara's answer at this point. Okay, if something isn't clear, please again interrupt me. So again, in the temple, they had shofar and trumpets going simultaneously. Trumpets stop at one point, shofar keeps on going. And at this point, the Gemara is suggesting the reason why the shofar would keep on going is so that the listener can actually discern where the shofar is. Otherwise, it would just get lost in the trumpets. Says the Gemara, there's a problem with this assertion. Lememra, again, I'm reading in the Hebrew, but you can read it along in the English. Lememra, are you suggesting, says the Gemara, the chishama soif tekiya, the light techilas tekiya, if someone were to hear the tail end of a shofar sound, but not the beginning, yotza, are you suggesting that he will have fulfilled his obligation? Umamela, and then it would follow then that techilas tekiya, if someone were to hear the beginning of the shofar sound, the loy soif tekiya, without hearing the end of the shofar sound, yotza, he will have fulfilled his obligation. That's the implication. If the Gemara is suggesting that the reason why in temple they would make the shofar sound longer than the trumpets would stop, the shofar would keep on going, and the reason is so the listeners can discern where the shofar is, that seems to suggest that if a person hears just the tail end of the shofar, he fulfilled his obligation. And it would also suggest, therefore, that if someone heard the beginning of the shofar sound, he also fulfilled his obligation. It's almost as if you don't have to hear the whole thing, only part of it. And this, of course, is challenging. This, of course, presents a big problem, as the Gemara will now tell us. Tashma, come and listen. Again, I'm reading the Hebrew, follow in the English, though. Taka b'rishayna. If someone was blowing the shofar, so the shofar sound, as we know it, has tekiah, the long blasts, and then the broken up blasts, and then the long blast. That's one set. And then you go to the next set, long blast, the tekiah, broken up blast, and then again the long blast. So what happens if taka b'rishayna, one was blowing the shofar in his first set, umashach b'shniya, and what he did was he made a very, very long tekiah, a very long, straight, uninterrupted blast, hoping kishtayim, long enough for two. What he wants to do is he wants this long blast to serve both as the conclusion of the first set and the beginning of the next set. Okay, I hope that was clear. So he's tekiah, long, uninterrupted blast, teruah, broken up blast, and then again, a tekiah, long blast. Now, instead of stopping and then starting the next set with a long, uninterrupted tekiah, he just made one double long tekiah, hoping that half would belong to the first set and the other half would belong to the second set. Now, the Mishnah teaches, ein biyadai ela achas. It only counts for one. You can't do that. You cannot have one long blast and somehow in your mind assume that half the blast belongs to the conclusion of the previous set and the second half of the blast to the beginning of the next set. That doesn't work. One has to make the break. And the Gemara asks, Amai, why is that? Why doesn't it work? If, as we suggested earlier, one can hear only part of the sound of the shofar, and that's good enough, which is why in the temple, the shofar sound would outlast the sound of the trumpet so that the person can hear the end. And that implies that if a person only hears part of the shofar sound, it's good enough. So why isn't then the part of the shofar, this long blast, why can't the first part belong to the first set and the second part belong to the second set? If all you need is only part of the sound, you don't need the entirety of the sound. So the Gemara says, why not divide it into two? The Gemara suggests, okay, it's true that all you need is only part of the sound. But just because you need only part of the sound, it doesn't mean we're allowing you to consider one sound as if it's only half. So we're making a bit of a distinction. In the temple, you can hear the shofar sound longer than the sound of the trumpet, and that counts as your shofar. But when you're blowing one long shofar and trying to divide it into two, that doesn't work. Because we don't break it up just because all you need is only half. Hope that was somewhat clear. If it's not, please interrupt me. Okay, so at this point, the Gemara is still with the assumption that a person can hear part of the shofar sound and still fulfill his obligation. And this is based on the fact that in the temple, they had the trumpets would stop, the shofar would keep on going, and this way the listener can discern the shofar sound distinct from the trumpets because the trumpets already stopped. And a person can fulfill his obligation just by hearing that tail end of the shofar. That's the assumption at the moment. Even though one long blast cannot be divided into two. But the Gemara raises another objection to this assumption. And this now we come to our conclusion, which is the main point we're trying to get to. Well, almost. Tashma, come and listen. Come and hear. The Mishnah teaches us that if one is blowing the shofar inside of a pit, or he's in some sort of like okay, translated here as a cistern, some sort of like an enclosure, or he's blowing into a jug. So now there's an echo. Besides the shofar sound, the listener hears also an echo. And therefore the Mishnah teaches, im kol shofar shamar, if the listener can distinctly hear the sound of the shofar, yatsa, he fulfills his obligation. But ve'im kol havara shama, if he hears the sound of the echo, then lo yatsa, he does not fulfill his obligation. Because one must hear the sound of the shofar, not the sound of the echo. This, by the way, parenthetically, this plus other problems is one of the reasons why shofar through a microphone won't count, or through Zoom or some other medium, because one's not hearing the sound of the shofar. One is hearing the electrified sound created by the electrical current that's banging against the piece of metal inside of the speaker. And here, as we're learning, the person must hear the shofar itself, not even the echo. Never mind the sound created by a piece of metal vibrating at the end of a speaker. Okay, so this is a teaching. Jewish law. One has to hear the shofar itself, not the echo. So the Gemara asks, if we are accepting the assumption that one can hear only part of the sound of the shofar, and that's good enough. Amai, why does the echo present the problem? Lipuk b'tchilas tkiya. Let him fulfill his obligation by the fact that he heard the shofar at the beginning, mikame de la arviv kala, before the echo arrives. Right? The echo does not sound right away with the original sound. It takes time for the sound waves to bounce off the wall of the pit, create an echo. So there's a moment when the person hears the shofar before the echo arrives. If then, as we assumed, that one may hear only part of the sound of the shofar, and that's good enough, and which is why, again, back to the temple. In the temple, they had the trumpets and then the shofar sound going longer, and the ending of the shofar sound after the trumpets have stopped. That's good enough for someone to fulfill his obligation, implying that a person only must hear part of the shofar sound. If that's the case, says the Gemara asks, if that's the case, why is the echo a problem when seemingly before the echo is heard, you hear the actual sound of the shofar, if only part of the sound of the shofar is good enough? The Gemara therefore says, again, please interrupt me if this is not clear. I know it's a bit of a complex back and forth Gemara, but if it's not clear, please interrupt me. Ella, rather, the Gemara therefore says, Tarti kala michad gavra, hearing two sounds from one person, the shofar and the echo, loy mishtama, that is too difficult to discern. But mitre gavre mishtama, two sounds from two different people, that you can discern. Meaning to say, the Gemara is now retracting that assumption. And the Gemara is saying, no, you must hear the entirety of the sound of the shofar. Now, the reason why in the temple, you were able to fulfill your obligation, even though there were trumpet sounds going, when seemingly you have to hear the entirety of the sound of the shofar. The reason why you still fulfill your obligation is because when the two sounds are distinct from each other, shofar and trumpets coming from different people, distinct from each other, then the listener can actually discern between one sound and the other. So even though there are trumpets going in the background, the listener can still hear, oh, that's the shofar sound. But when it comes to the echo, where the two sounds are identical, it's too difficult to discern. And the same thing is true with, as they mentioned here in the commentary here, the translation, the same thing is true of God saying, remember the Shabbos and keep the Shabbos. Because those two utterances, those two words, zachar and shamar, remember and keep, are both coming from God's voice, it's too difficult to discern because it's one voice. But when the voices are distinct, trumpet and shofar, then you can discern. And thus in the temple, they were able to hear the entirety of the sound of the shofar because it's a distinct sound from the trumpet. And if the listener can discern between the shofar and the trumpet, and thus he fulfills his obligations. But the Gemara presents a challenge to this too. The Gemara asks, are you suggesting that when you hear two sounds from two different people, you can discern the difference? That doesn't seem to be the case. Vatanya, we have been taught as following. The Mishnah teaches us the Torah, when someone is reading the Torah, echad kaira, one person should read the Torah, the echad matargim, and somebody else can translate the Torah. The way the Torah reading used to work back in the day is the reader would read the text of the Torah, and he would pause at the end of each verse, and there would be somebody standing next to him, and that person would call out the translation in ancient Aramaic. It's an interesting custom. So the community, if they didn't understand the original text of the Hebrew, they spoke Aramaic, that was the common tongue, and they would understand what's going on. So the reader would read a verse, and then he would pause, and the translator would read a translation. I actually saw this practiced once. I once spent a Shabbos in a village in Israel, if I remember the name of the village correctly, it was Kfar Tapuach. That's what I think it was. And my host told me, you want to see something interesting? Go spend Shabbos at this synagogue, at the Taimani Yemenite synagogue. So I went there for Shabbos morning service, and there they read the Torah exactly as they did way back in Talmudic times, where they had one person reading, he would read a verse, he would stop, and then there was somebody next to him who would read out the translation. So the Torah reading was way longer than it is, it's actually double the length of what we experience in Torah reading. So if you thought Torah reading is long here at our synagogue or here in North America and the way Ashkenazim and Sephardim read it, go spend the Shabbos morning at a Yemenite synagogue where they do it the ancient way, where it's double the length. Because the person would read a verse, he would stop, and there was somebody next to him who would call up the translation. Aside from the fact that the Yemenite pronunciation of the words was also very, very different than ours. Like, for example, every single letter, every single word by the Yemenite in this synagogue was different than the others. So, for example, us, a tes, taf, and saf are almost all the same. Taf, taf, and tes. So they all come out as a T. But for them, it was different. The saf, the one without the dot, they actually pronounced it as a thuf with a lisp. And similarly, other letters that they pronounce differently. Like, for example, when there's a gimel and there's a dot in the gimel, they would say j. So it took me a while to be able to follow even the reading, because the pronunciation was different, but it was quite fascinating to be part of this anyway. Anyway, close parentheses. What we're saying here is the Mishnah is teaching us that one person should read the Torah and somebody else should do the translation. But ubulvad, please be certain, says the Mishnah, do not have two people reading at once and don't have two people translating at once. This seems to imply that you cannot hear and you cannot distinguish between two voices that are coming from two different people simultaneously. If that's the case, then if we cannot discern between the two readers of the Torah, and therefore it's hard to follow, and if we cannot discern between the two voices of the translators, because it's hard to follow, then seemingly we should not be able to discern between the shofar sound and the trumpet sound in the temple, leaving us back to square one. How is it possible that in the temple, where they had shofar sounded together with the trumpet sounding, how is it possible for people to have fulfilled their obligation of hearing the shofar when they cannot discern the sound? Because there's two things going at once. And we just learned now that you cannot hear two voices at once, even as they're reading the same text of the Torah. Therefore, the Gemara concludes, keep on reading that Mishnah, which you just quoted about Torah reading, and you'll see where it helps us understand the shofar. The Mishnah continues and reads, Bahalel ubahagada. Bahalel Megillah, I'm sorry. When we are listening to someone read the Hallel, or we are listening to someone reading the Megillah, afilu asara koden. You can have a choir of 10 people singing the Megillah. You can have a choir of 10 people reading the Hallel. They can read. Why? Seemingly, there's too many voices. We won't be able to discern one sound. Explains the Gemara. Alma, this comes to teach you. Kivin the Chaviv, because Hallel and the Megillah is a precious item. It's something we enjoy. It's something we want to listen to. Then the listener pays extra attention to really discern and listen to the sound of the voice. And therefore, Hachanami, the same thing is true of the shofar. Kivan the Chaviv, because the sound of the shofar is so precious to the Jew, Yahiv Daita V'Shaima, the listener can pay special attention and find the sound of the shofar. So this is what the Gemara is telling us. That in temple times, they have trumpets blasting, they have a shofar going, and seemingly the voices are contradicting each other. It's hard to discern which one's which. Mishnah says, no. A Jew loves the sound of the shofar so much that he can actually pay extra attention and find the sound of the shofar from within the blasts of the trumpets. Just like a Jew loves Hallel. Who doesn't love Hallel? Who doesn't love the Megillah? Who doesn't love the whole story? Everybody loves it. So even if you have 10, 15, a whole choir singing the Hallel and a whole choir singing the Megillah, it doesn't matter. The listener is so excited about this that they can pay special attention and really pick up and detect the proper sounds of the Hallel and the proper sounds of the Megillah and the proper sounds of the shofar, even though there are trumpets being accompanying it. And this is the main point I wanted to get to. And the next line as well, which is even from the Jewish legal text, even though we have no background yet as to what the meaning of the shofar is. And the verse was kind of cryptic as to how we got to the shofar. It's not as if the verse said, thou shalt blast the shofar in Rosh Hashanah. We didn't see that. The verse says, it's the remembrance of blasts of a teruah. And we have a verse in Tehillim which says that on the holiday on which the moon is hidden, blow the shofar. So it's this cryptic kind of verse, but nonetheless, the halacha tells us that a Jew is so excited about the shofar that even as the shofar is being sounded along with trumpets, he can still discern the sound of the shofar because he's so excited about it. He's as excited for shofar as he is excited for Hallel and Megillah. And then final line from the Gemara before we get to the symbolism. So if this is the case, if one can discern the sound between the shofar and the trumpets because he's so excited about the shofar that the person can hear the sound even though there's trumpets there, if that's the case in the temple, why would the shofar sound last longer than the sound of the trumpets? Right? We learned earlier that the trumpets would be blasted and the shofar is accompanied with the trumpets, but the trumpets would stop and the shofar sound would keep on going. If we just finished saying, and if we established that because the Jew is so excited about shofar, he can discern that sound, so why have the shofar go longer than the trumpets? What's the point? Says the Gemara, Leda, this is to inform all the listeners, Mitzvahs hayom b'shofar. Even though there are trumpets being sounded, you should know the primary mitzvah here is the shofar. And we demonstrate that by making the shofar last longer than the trumpets. So here are the two things that we are taking when we want to talk about the halachic legal definition of the shofar. Number one, the Jew is so excited about shofar that the person can hear the shofar sound even though there's trumpets being blasted as well. Number one. Number two, you want to know the mitzvah that defines today, shofar. Even though there might be other things we're doing on Rosh Hashanah, including a brisket and apples and honey and all the other beautiful customs and even some mitzvahs that we have to do on Rosh Hashanah. But the essence of the mitzvah of the day, that's shofar. And therefore, even as the temple has trumpets going, very fancy other music, but the shofar is the essence of it. The shofar is the mitzvah of the day. And thus, it's to be blasted and sounded longer than the trumpets. So there we have the legal halachic idea of shofar, and that it's quote, the mitzvah of the day, without telling us exactly what the symbolism is, what the message here is, what's the reason behind it, nothing yet. All we know is we've derived from these two verses that the essence of the mitzvah of the day is shofar. And for some reason, Jews are so excited about it, they can hear the shofar even though there's trumpets being blasted in the temple along with the shofar. Now here we have some symbolism. Now this text that we're looking at, I'm not going to read the whole thing and translate it because we're running short on time, but you can have a look at it. It's Maimonides' Laws of Teshuvah, chapter 3, section paragraph 4. Actually, the last few weeks on Wednesday and Thursday night here at MTC and on the other Zoom channel, my Zoom channel, we've been learning Rambam's Laws of Teshuvah, very fascinating. So here he says the following in the Laws of Teshuvah. He says, look, I'll just read the beginning part, which is just short and making the point. Even though, in the essence, the blasting of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah is a decree of the verse. The verse doesn't give us any background. As we just noted before, the verse does not say, the Torah does not say any background as to why the shofar is being sounded. It barely even says the word shofar explicitly. We got to find a verse in Psalms to tell us that there's a shofar, right? But the Torah says, okay, do it. No reason. But nonetheless, remez yesh bai. There is a symbolism to the shofar. Kalaymar, the shofar, it's as if the shofar is saying, Uru yisheinim mishnaschem. Wake up, you sleepers from your sleep. V'nirdamim, and you who slumber. Hakitzim mitardei maschem. I think I'm pronouncing it correctly. Wake up from your slumber. Chipshu masechem, investigate your behavior. V'chizru b'tshuva, do repentance, do teshuvah. V'zichru b'racham, remember your creator. And it goes on to say, this is a call to those who just as time rolls on, they forget the truth. They forget what they're looking for. They forget what life is all about because they're busy running and chasing who knows what. Comes the shofar sound like a spiritual alarm clock and says, wake up. We got to look and see what we're doing. Where are we going? What are we trying to gain? How are we behaving? Have we been living up to the standards we know we should be living up to, and so on and so forth? So what we see here from Rambam, from this text, is that the essence of shofar is not to do teshuvah. It's the symbolism of teshuvah. In fact, he begins by saying, shofar on Rosh Hashanah is a decree of the verse. No background in the Torah as to why you should blow shofar. But there is a hidden message in there. There's a symbolism. And the symbolism is wake up to do teshuvah. And this is further highlighted by the fact that this statement of Rambam, that there's a symbolism in the shofar, is not in the laws of shofar. It's in the laws of teshuvah. Because the shofar itself is not about teshuvah per se. It's a symbolism embedded in the shofar. But the essence of shofar is not necessarily teshuvah. The essence of the shofar, as he says here, it's just the verse decided. Torah said, blow shofar, without any background, without any reason. But there's a symbolism, wake up to do teshuvah. Okay, so we're kind of like, we're grasping at something here. We know shofar is precious, because even when there's trumpets blasting, we can discern the sound of the shofar. We know it's the mitzvah of the day, which is why the shofar sound is extended longer than the sound of the trumpets. We know there's a symbolism, which means wake up to teshuvah, but none of this tells us what is shofar, what's the essence of it. And the main point, which is why is the verse so cryptic about it? Why is the verse so cryptic about the shofar sounding? On the first day of the 7th month, you should have a remembrance of blasts. What's that? No idea. Oh, go to Psalms and you'll see there it says that on the holiday where the moon is hidden, that holiday that's on the first day of the month, the one in Rosh Hashanah, yeah, sound the shofar then. Why is it so cryptic? Why can't the verse just say, blow shofar for X reason? Just like it does with matzah. Eat matzah because you left Egypt in a haste. Very clear. Fast on Yom Kippur because it's a day of atonement. Very clear. Right? Sit in the sukkah because it reminds us that we were in the desert and we were sheltered by God. Why with the shofar is it so cryptic? And even the symbolism of teshuvah, Rambam is very keen on telling us it's not the essence of the shofar, it's the symbolism of the shofar. But the essence of it, just God wanted you to blow a shofar. It doesn't say why or how or what. Now the answer is here in the next line of the Talmud, based on the way Chassidus explains it. The Talmud says that on Rosh Hashanah, as we know, Imru Lofanai Rosh Hashanah, God says, please read before me on Rosh Hashanah. Malchios, verses that describe divine sovereignty. Zachronos, read verses that describe divine remembrance. The Shofros, and read verses that describe shofar. And that's indeed how our prayer is structured. The Amidah on Rosh Hashanah has extra sections that describe and that quote verses of divine sovereignty. They quote verses and describe divine remembrance, and it quotes verses and describes shofar. What's the reason for these three things? Sovereignty, remembrance, and shofar. So says the Gemara. Malchios, read verses of sovereignty. Kidei shetamlichuni aleichem, so that I become king over you. Zachronos, read verses that describe divine remembrance, so that I, God, shall remember you favorably. So remind me of that stuff. So quote verses that describe how God remembers our favor. Uvameh, and with what do we accomplish these two items? Reminding God of our good deeds and crowning God as king, the shofar through the shofar. And here we have the essence of shofar. The essence of shofar is the Jew declaring to God, you are king. That's the essence of shofar. Which explains why the verse is not explicit about it. The whole point of crowning God as king, as we read in our Friday night service, divine sovereignty to be accepted willingly. A king who forces his dominion over his people is not a king, he's a dictator. A king must be crowned by the people. That's a true king, which means the people must decide that they want the king. So if God were to come out straightforward and say, hey, blow the shofar because I want you to declare me king, then it would ruin the whole thing. It would be us fulfilling God's command. It wouldn't be us truly crowning God as king. So God kind of hints at it and says, there's a remembrance of blasts there. And God wants us to realize, hey, he's expecting us. He's hoping that we crown him as king. You know, this is true of the dynamics of relationships in which not always do you want the other person, or you don't always want to tell the other person explicitly, hey, please do this and this for me. Kind of ruins the whole thing. You drop hints and you hope that the person you're in a relationship with is sensitive enough to pick up the hints and does it on his own. Now there's a good relationship. So likewise with the Jewish people and God. God doesn't come out straightforward and say, hey, make me your king by blowing shofar. He drops this hint on us and says, there's a day of blasting here. And he wants us to pick up and say, oh, yes, you're our king. We accept you and we're your subjects. We're dedicated to you. And that's the essence of shofar. The essence of shofar is the Jew declaring, I belong to you. Now, if I belong to you, then there's the symbolism. If I belong to you, then I better live up to that. Then comes the teshuvah. The symbolism of the shofar, which is the teshuvah, the call to teshuvah, is a result of the essence of shofar. The essence of shofar is I declare, I am yours, God. Now, if I am yours, God, then are you living up to that? And there's the teshuvah symbolism. So you have three layers here. The essence of shofar, God, you're our king. I am your subject. I dedicate my life to you. Then comes the next level. Well, if I'm dedicated to you, there's a message here. We have to live up to that dedication. And there's the teshuvah element. And all of that is implemented on the basic level, fulfilling a mitzvah doing teshuvah. Fulfilling a mitzvah blowing the shofar. The actual literal mitzvah that we have to implement, fulfilling God's desires if we are indeed doing teshuvah and if we are indeed declaring him as king. And one final thought on this essence of teshuvah as explained in Hasidus and Kabbalah. This idea of declaring God as king is taken so far in Kabbalah and Hasidus to the following. Hasidus teaches that as Rosh Hashanah begins, on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, God sits back, as it were, takes all the energy and all the excitement that God has invested in creating our world, takes it all back, so to speak, folds his arms, in kind of metaphoric quotations, and says, okay, look, I did this whole thing called creation. Is it worth it? Is it worth it? The whole point of creation, the whole point of everything was because I wanted a relationship with you, dear Jew. Are you in? That's what Rosh Hashanah is. So God retracts his energy. This is how Chassidus describes it. God literally retracts his energy from the world to the point that Chassidus says that from the moment Rosh Hashanah starts until the sound of the shofar, the world is in a state of faint. It's operating because mechanically God is giving energy into it, but he's not really invested in it with his whole desire. He's not really sure if he really wants this whole thing. And when the Jew blows a shofar and says, yes, you are our king, I am yours, God says, okay, it's worth it then. I'm back, I'm in. And God reinvests his whole excitement and energy back into the world for another year. So this is the essence then of shofar. Declaring God as king on a personal level, telling God, I am yours. I don't have any other worries in life. I don't serve anybody else. I don't serve algorithms, and I don't serve social pressures, and I don't serve, whatever the other thing people feel like they're serving in their life. I serve you. You're my king. That's it. Nothing else concerns me. And in response, God says, that's how we are connected. Good. And this whole project called creation is worth it. Which is why when we declare God as king on Rosh Hashanah, we're constantly referring to God, not just as king over us personally, which we do, not just God as king over the Jewish people, which we do, but we describe God as king over all of the universe, not just all of humanity, but all of the universe, period. Because with the Jew declaring God as his king, and with the Jew dedicating himself and saying to God, I am yours, in the sound of the shofar, then God says the whole project called creation was worth it. And that's the essence of Rosh Hashanah. That's the essence of shofar. And teshuvah comes as a result of that. If I am indeed yours, then I need to make sure that I'm living up to that. And I need to implement that in our daily life. And that comes after Rosh Hashanah. Once we've declared on Rosh Hashanah, we are yours. I am yours, dear God. Then after Rosh Hashanah, we have to go through the process of living up to our declaration we made in the sound of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. So hope that was all clear, and thank you all for sharing. Have a wonderful rest of your day and a happy and sweet new year to all. As a loving parent, no doubt God gives every one of us all the blessings we require, all the blessings we need, the ones we know we need, and the ones we don't know we need. God grants them all in good health for Shana Tova Mituka. Thank you all and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank
Shabbat
you.
Tov, all the best, Rabbi.
you.
Like I said,
Shabbat
gebench
Tov.
to everybody, gebench